Well, good morning, everyone, to a special time for Young Red Angus Live. I'm your host, Jay Young, and thank you so much for making this live show a part of your day. The focus of Young Red Angus Live is to interview people within the regenerative agricultural community to help bring you guys, the viewer, information and content that are going to help you guys be better at farming or ranching or whatever it is you find yourself doing. Well, good morning, everyone, to a special time for agricultural area. I thought I muted my computer, but apparently I didn't. So anyway, today's guest is a friend of mine and someone who I look up to a lot, Lance Gunderson. And Lance started Regen Ag Labs. How many years ago, Lance?
Yeah, it feels like 20 years ago, but 2019.
Awesome. So Lance was someone I thought would be really helpful to bring onto the show, because when I think for me, the big eye opener on why the Johnson Sioux compost works so well was that doing that complete soil digestion test. Am I saying that? Nutrition digestion test.
Yeah.
And for me, that was a huge eye opener. And then also someone that I've been doing regenerative agriculture since 2017. And I've heard about the Haney test from the very beginning. And I kept thinking, I have no idea how to understand any of that crap on a soil test. I'll wait until I know more. And so it kept going year after year to where the last few years I was planning on doing it, and then I just never got around to pulling soil samples and doing it. And so that was the other reason why I wanted to have you on, Lance, is so that we could help communicate to people what each one of these tests are that you guys run, and why they're not something to be intimidated by just because you may not understand it. You guys at the lab can help you sift through the information and understand what they are. So let's go ahead and just start with yourself. What led you into the field that you're in today? You started as a lab tech, and now that you're where you're at today, what got you into doing that?
Yeah, it's kind of a different path, right? I mean, and how in the world did somebody end up going this direction? Well, I guess for me, I'm going to start way back, Jay.
Okay.
I always wanted to be a biologist. Matter of fact, I wanted to be a marine biologist. So I told everybody, hey, I'm going to study sharks. That's what I'm going to do. Obviously, geography was not a strong suit for me because I was sitting in central Nebraska, as far away from any ocean as you could possibly get. Found out there were no sharks in the Platte River. I was fortunate enough. Some of you know, some of you don't know. I shadowed Dr. Ray Ward at Ward Laboratories when I was in 8th grade. Want to check out his lab? It was awesome. I wanted to get some lab experience while I was going to school, so I started working at Ward Laboratories in 2001, and worked there. Ray wanted me to grind soils. Of course, I told him, no way, I want to be a lab tech. I want to work in the lab. So he accommodated that, and I got a chance to work in the lab. But I always still wanted to do biology. That's really what I wanted to do. So I went to school for biology, majored in biology, double majored in chemistry. And then around 2010, I went back to school for a master's degree in microbiology. And at that time, I met Dr. Jill Clapperton, and she was talking about looking at microbes in the soil. And I thought, well, hey, let's do this. So that was really the foundational piece. My love for biology is what kind of got me started. But what kept me in agriculture, actually, or what I loved about it, is I didn't mind doing the lab tech work, but I really love doing these things. Education, working with farmers, and to be honest, I loved hearing their stories, both good and bad, right? Success, failure, etc. But I saw a community of people that was kind of sitting there going, you know what? We feel trapped by the ag industry. And that's all of it. I mean, that's the labs, universities, crop insurance, all of it, name it all, right? And some of these people were sitting here going, look, we don't feel like what we're doing is working. We want to do something different. And I guess I've always kind of looked at myself as kind of I'm gonna buck the status quo. That's just the way I am. And I was liking biology, and I got a chance to meet Dr. Rick Haney and Dr. Liz Haney, and I got, and so I started in a snowball. But really it was the community, it was the people. I met a lot of names that most of us know. I mean, wonderful people, David Brandt, Jay Fuhrer. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but met these people, and that's really what drew me to this, is trying to help farmers and ranchers who wanted to change.
That's awesome. So what was it that specifically sparked your interest and made you realize that like there's a different way to farm? Was it Jill Clapperton, like, or?
I mean, it's a combination of things. I mean, Jill obviously had a big piece of that. I mean, as well as several others. But for me, honestly, I didn't grow up on a farm. And so I mean, I worked on a farm, but my family didn't own a farm. And, I did whatever I was told to do, but I didn't have, 100 years worth of ingrained farming driven into my head about what it should or shouldn't be. I'm not trained as a soil scientist, educational wise, like I didn't go through the institution, do agronomy, do soil science. So I didn't have all of this kind of pre-programming that was set up. And really the biggest piece was just sitting down with people like Rick Haney, and listening to logic. I kind of joke around is that sometimes, as a scientist, we want to try to understand every tiny, minute detail of every single thing, right? And that's the reductionism of science. That's what you're taught. So you take something incredibly complex, you tear it apart down to its finite pieces, and in that process, you lose sight of what you were actually looking to study in the first place. You don't see the forest through the trees, if you will. So I always ask people, I say, like, how many people listening to this or anywhere understand fully every single detail of how human metabolism works? When you eat something, walk me through the process. Tell me all the enzymes involved, the whole process. Not very many people can tell you that information. But the one thing everybody does understand is that if you don't eat long enough, you die. So you don't have to understand metabolism to know that it works and see those observations. So it's that kind of logic, honestly, that simple, just ridiculously simple logic. And it was the fact that, it rains water. The simple fact that nobody's fertilizing a prairie and grass is growing. And I understand a prairie is not an ag system, but my point is that these things still happen. And those are questions that didn't go away for me. And I would sit there and ponder on that and go, well, why do we do it this way? Why does ag as an industry do certain things? And those were just questions I couldn't get away from.
Awesome. So Lance, let's start off by talking about the soil test specifically. If I'm going out and I'm pulling soil samples, and I'm doing regenerative agriculture, what is different from what Regen Ag Labs does with the Haney test compared to what other labs do? Like if they just send off a sample and say, our agronomist sends it off to K-State and runs, test on it.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's obvious differences we'll talk about. There's also similarities. But it's really a little bit of it is the approach. So I'll start off by saying this, is that and when I say we, again, I'm talking about ag as a whole, not picking on any one group, but we have created an ag system driven on chemistry for the most part, and that chemistry includes, whether it's altering the genetics or coating a seed, or whether it's, applying the fertility in, quote unquote synthetic fertility or whatever, or whether it's herbicide, pesticide, we're trying to control this environment. We're trying to control it through chemistry. And the issue is that these systems operate through chemistry second to biology. So chemistry influences biology, but biology has a huge influence on chemistry. And in the native systems, biology drives the chemistry. And so the approach that we take and that, Dr. Haney took was saying, okay, look, we need to evaluate the soil system. We need to include chemistry, the things that we're used to seeing, right? Nitrate, phosphate, potassium, etc. But we also need to start including this biological portion. And so he was developing a test to evaluate soil respiration, looking at microbial biomass. He was trying to look at what the microbes are eating in the system, because what energy are they using, what carbon, and then what they're going to kick back out. And ultimately, it boils down to the idea that we now understand, I say we, not me necessarily, but we now understand how important gut health is for human health, right? And it's the microbiome in the gut.
Yeah.
Well, that's because we kind of had this idea that when we would consume food, that our intestines just absorb the nutrients. Kind of like when we put nutrients on the soil, the roots are there just to take them out, right? And suck them out of the soil. Well, what we found is that biology is driving that whole process. In your gut, it's the microbiome that dictates what you absorb, and heck, it influences your mood, it influences your emotions and your hormones and all these things, right? Well, the soil is the gut of agriculture. And we have ignored that portion for a really long time. And then on top of that, we beat it up. We've destroyed it. So our approach with soil testing is, I kind of use this analogy. I'm an analogy person, if you don't know me, but I've got this analogy where I said, look, for years in agriculture, soil was treated as a warehouse. So we treat the soil as a warehouse, and we measure nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc. We're looking at what's stocked in the warehouse. And then we've got the plant, the crop is your factory, and we're concerned with the output of the factory, yield. If we're not happy with the yield, at the end of the year, you pull soil samples, you send them in, they analyze the warehouse, and then we say, well, you were short of this, and this, so go buy these things, restock the warehouse. And if the warehouse is stocked and we're still not happy, then we come up with 100 excuses as to what's happening, right? Well, we've got compaction, root issues. We've got imbalances in all these ratios, again, looking at chemistry, right? Calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, all these different ratios. So now buy more products and balance all this stuff out, right? See, so it's always, we're addressing the warehouse, trying to get the factory to do what we want it to do. Nobody is really paying too much attention on a large scale as to, well, how do these goods from the warehouse make it to the factory? And it's a transport team. And if COVID taught me anything, this, when I was laying in bed upset because we couldn't get things, we'd order things, and the same scenario everybody was in, right? Mm-hmm. Couldn't get anything delivered. And I said, well, what's the problem? Transport team. And the microbes are this transport team. And we've got to have the dock unloaders, the truck drivers, the forklift operators. You need a diversity of transport people in that role. So our approach then is to say, well, we need to know what's in the warehouse. It's still important to know what's coming out of the factory. It's important sometimes to evaluate what's in the factory, right? Plant tissue testing, plant sap testing, which we don't do plant sap testing. We work with New Age Laboratories in Michigan for people that want to do that work. And then now we're looking at, tests like PLFA, Biomaker's B crop, which is, I say PLFA on steroids, metagenomics, evaluating the players in this transport team. The Haney test is used to evaluate the warehouse. And it's a different look. So the big difference is the extract being used. And Rick Haney says, well, we use chemistry again to evaluate chemistry. And we're using chemistry with a lot of these soil tests that doesn't exist outside of a soil lab. And so again, that simple logic where it was like, it rains water, can't argue with that. We irrigate with water. And when water mixes with soil, it creates a solution that is dictated by what's soluble in that soil. And that includes primarily plant root exudates, decomposition products, and the nutrients that you're trying to evaluate. And if you want to get more nutrients in the solution, use a stronger solution, right? So you can change the solution and get different amounts of these nutrients in it. The goal, though, should be not how much you can take out and make soluble. The goal should be how much of this is actually soluble in real life out in the field to a crop. That's how the warehouse should be evaluated. And so those are the steps that we kind of look at and that doesn't mean you have to evaluate every single step. You know, it's just that if you know the warehouse is good, but you're having trouble with the crop, meaning you're seeing deficiencies and you're seeing, yield drag and things like that. Well, maybe we shouldn't go back and evaluate the warehouse. Maybe we should look at this transport team, right?
Yep.
If you've got all the transporters there, everybody's there, but you don't have any phosphorus available, well, then address the warehouse, and let's get some phosphorus in one way, shape, or form. So trying to pick out those problems, because we've been beating this horse for 70 years, right? The fertilizer horse. And I'm not against fertilizer, but again, it's not free. And I think that we've been overdoing it for years and years and years, trying to push the factory warehouse output, the yield up, and up. And we've got other limiting factors.
So Lance, last year I ran that test, the complete soil nutrition digestion test, and it showed that I had 3,000 pounds of nitrogen in my soil, and then also that I had it was 1,200 pounds of phosphorus. So I was able to gain access to that from the Johnson Sioux compost, adding the biology. What's a way someone can find out, like, let's say they run that test, how can they find out if they have the biology already available to have access to those micronutrients and macronutrients? And how would they be able to know, well, do I actually need Johnson Sioux compost? Do I need an extract applied to this field? Because for people like Gabe Brown, who's gotten up to, is it 6% organic matter right now, right? So yes. For guys that have achieved that high of organic matter, do they need to be applying compost extracts? Are they the place where they already have the biology there and it's not necessary? And then how is it that we get access to those micronutrients that are tied up in our soil?
Yeah, that's so you covered an entire transition of exactly what we're trying to help producers do. So I'll kind of step through that. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the total nutrient digest or the complete soil digest, what that is we are using the strongest extractant. It's a hydrogen peroxide and nitric acid digestion of the soil, and it burns off all the organic matter. Okay. Within that organic matter, so 1% soil organic matter is about 20,000 pounds. 12,000 pounds of that is carbon, 1,000 pounds of that is nitrogen, 100 pounds of that is phosphorus, and then you've got sulfur, potassium, calcium, magnesium. So you got all the plant nutrients tied up in there. So we're releasing all of those nutrients in this test. We're stripping off all the nutrients off the soil particles, the CEC, the cation exchange. We're taking all of that off, And this is like evaluating the net worth of your soil fertility. So, Jay, you mentioned 3,000 pounds of nitrogen. Well, you probably have organic matter around 3% on that soil, and it's not always exact, but it's pretty close.
So Lance, real quick, so people can see that, let me go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
Real quick, so people can see that, if I can figure this out. Hold on one second. I usually am good at this, and let's see here.
Better you than me. I was lucky to get my video turned on.
Share screen. All right. Is it doing it? Oh, I'm allowing me to share screen. I need to share my own screen. Oh, here we go. Share screen. It was in big and green on the bottom. It said share screen. I don't know how I missed it.
Well, while you're doing that, Jay, so I'll mention, so on that total nutrient digest, so like I said, we're evaluating the net worth of the soil fertility. That this includes available and unavailable nutrients to your crop, okay? And we equate that out into pounds per acre based on the depth of the sample. So if Jay gets this pulled up, he mentioned 1,200 pounds of phosphorus in his soil. It's 1,200 pounds of phosphorus in his soil to the depth he tested it. So if he took an 8-inch sample, that's 1,200 pounds in the top 8 inches. If you know that you've got corn roots going 5 feet down, I'm not telling you to go out and pull a 5-foot sample, but I'm saying you can do that, and you could do it in increments, 0 to 12, 12 to 24, et cetera, et cetera. And you can sum those together and say, well, I've got X number of pounds all the way down of sulfur, phosphorus, et cetera. So why do we want to know that? Well, the idea here is that biology, microbes contain the tools to access that. They contain the enzymes, and they use the plant. So the plant provides the food to the microbes through root exudates. It gives them amino sugars, simple carbon compounds, the energy to drive this engine. The microbes take that energy and try to access nutrients. And if you think about why that is, now the microbes need nutrients too, but the microbes are farming the plant. Why do we grow plants? To capture carbon and eat it, and nutrients. Well, the microbes want the carbon too. They eat like we do, and so they're farming the plant. They're giving these nutrients to the plant. So when we look at just soluble nutrients, like most soil tests do, that's what we manage as farmers, right? We're in ranchers. We're trying to increase or decrease or whatever that number is. But in natural systems, we've all seen a tree growing out of the side of a rock, right? And the rock is full of phosphorus, calcium, potassium. I mean, depending on what kind of rock it is, different amounts, but it's in there. And the tree and the microbes work together. In that case, usually mycorrhizal fungus, and they work together, and the mycorrhiza cannot live without the tree. And honestly, the tree can't live in that scenario without the mycorrhizal fungus. And the more nutrients that get driven to the tree, the bigger the tree, the more carbon it can capture, and the more fungus they can feed, right? And so it's a mutualism, and it's a trading, and it goes back and forth. So when you're starting out, the first idea, most of us have no idea what our net worth is, right? Because if you've been soil testing, you've just been looking at what's in your checking account. We monitor the checking account. And this is saying, well, look, let's take everything, look at all of it together. And then I've got people say, well, yeah, but we don't want to take all of that. No, you're right. We don't. That's not the goal. The goal is, if I make a bunch of investments, I want to live off the interest. I don't necessarily want to take all the investments out. I want to live off the interest. So we want the organisms to be happy and healthy, and they're going to move some of this phosphorus out and some of this potassium out and put it into play, if you will. They're going to put it into flux, right? It's going to enter this biological world, and it's going to be used and cycled and moved all the time. And then the plant gets a chance to use some of that because it's part of that. The microbe and plant are not separate. They're not. I mean, they are together. So they get a chance to use this. And the only time it leaves then is when we harvest that off and we haul it to feed whatever it is we're going to feed as farmers. That piece is the only piece that's really different than a native system, is the fact that we remove the nutrients. And the number one nutrient we remove is carbon. We don't ever worry about carbon. We haven't until recently, because, well, why do we care? Plants capture out of the air. So Jay, to your question, early on, what we have are systems that are mostly biologically degraded. And when we use those types of extracts, whether it's Johnson Sioux, just straight compost, manure, et cetera, we've always thought of manure as a nutrient source, and it is, but it's a microbial inoculant. We look at biological products, right? All of those things can help jumpstart that system and introduce organisms that are missing from this kind of broken down, degraded microbial community. So early on, I see a lot of benefit from those types of things, but as you kind of alluded to, is it, once we get the system running and things are really humming, here's what often you're going to see is you're going to stop seeing any kind of real response from a lot of those products. And I always get people that ask me, hey, does this product work? What do you think of this one? How about that? Should I use this? And I say, well, look, I've yet to see any product work everywhere, and I've yet to see any product never work anywhere. So it's not about a question of whether they work or don't. What I tell people is I say, if you try something and you don't see a response, that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean the product doesn't work. It doesn't mean the practice doesn't work. What it means is that your system didn't need that. It didn't respond. So Jay, you mentioned Gabe. I mean, if you were to apply a lot of these things to Gabe's farm, he doesn't see a response. But he also doesn't see a response from phosphorus fertilizer either, even though conventional agronomy would say he should. He doesn't see it. So that's kind of the transition goal, is how do we evaluate what's in the complete warehouse, and then build that, use these products, use the management practices, do this stuff, because what's 1,200 pounds of phosphorus worth?
5,000 pounds of mez.
Right, per acre.
Yep.
Right. So, what's it worth? And it's okay to use some of that.
Well, and that's why I love that test, because that's what the test says. It tells you, hey, it's this much. I think that's the other thing that's so hard. When I did those 2 videos that I knew kind of would be popular, I didn't know how popular they would be. But those videos, the nitrogen myth and the phosphorus problem, when I did those 2 videos, which, by the way, shout out to Dr. Christine Jones. She did a web deal on a webinar with Green Cover Seeds, and it was the nitrogen, the phosphorus paradox and the nitrogen problem. And so I just was like, I'm seeing this on my farm. I'm going to call it in this YouTube video, the nitrogen myth and the phosphorus problem. It's called the phosphorus paradox. And so anyway, when I did that video and I showed our tests and how much we had available, so many farmers and that were just seeing my video for the first time, didn't know anything about me, were like, that's BS. There's no way. You have to add nitrogen. This guy's crazy. He's full of it and stuff. And I'm amazed at how often people just balk at it and don't even want to learn, or it's so foreign to them. Just their knowledge of what they know, and the fact that you're telling them so foreign. You have to be a liar. You have to be a charlatan, and there's no possible way that's real. So that's why I love that test, is because, it gives you an idea that, it gave my dad the confidence that, we did that test, and the year before we had raised all that corn without applying phos. When he saw that and said, okay, that makes sense. Like the light bulb turned on, we're adding the biology. It's getting us this access to this phosphorus. He knows that phosphorus gets tied up in our soils. And so he was able to make that connection. And so for me, that was exciting seeing that with my dad, being able to make that transition. When it comes to, adding the biology, I had a great question here on YouTube Live from Steve. Steve Barnett asked, are you seeing a difference when you run like a PFLA test on compost from aerobic static or aerated static pile? Sorry. So an aerated static pile, are you seeing a difference between that kind of compost compared to Johnson Sioux? And then when you do Johnson Sioux test, how far are the gambits on when people are sending you like Johnson Sioux when they want to do a PFLA? Like how different do those batches end up being from people when people make Johnson Sioux?
Yeah, so the first part of that question, yeah, there's a big difference between compost. Not all composts are created equal. And the issue with kind of the static pile compost is that, or not even that, I mean, if you're not turning it at all, it goes anaerobic, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have organisms that are anaerobic. And PLFA by itself, I'll mention this, PLFA by itself is not going to identify species. Okay. So
well, let's get into that real quick, Lance. Explain to them what a PFLA test is and what it does and why people run compost.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And then remind me, we'll come back to that question. So PLFA stands for phospholipid fatty acids. And what it is it's a microbial community analysis. And all organisms, you and me, your dog, the plants, microbes, we're made up of cells. And inside those cells are the membranes around the cells. And those membranes are made up of fats. So fats are a biological molecule. Soil by itself without life, which we call dirt, by the way, dirt doesn't have fat. So we're extracting all these fats and then we quantify those. So we actually measure them and say, this is how much fat is in your soil. Beyond that, that total fat amount is microbial life. So we're only looking at fats that fall kind of in that microbial chain length category. We sum those together and we say, this is your total microbial life. Okay, it's an indicator of biomass because you can't really just count all the microbes. So secondarily, different organisms produce different types of fats. So bacteria produce a lot of what they call branched chain fatty acids. They're 14 carbon, 15 carbon chain lengths long, and they have these branches. Fungi, being a little more complex in the scale, they produce a lot of 16 and 18 carbon chain length fatty acids. So we can identify bacteria versus fungi. But again, there are, who knows, millions of species of bacteria, and PLFA cannot discriminate which species they are. That's not what that test does. We call these functional groups, right? So bacteria is a functional group, fungi is a functional group, protozoans is a functional group. Underneath that, we can look at saprophytic fungi, so your decomposers, and we can look at mycorrhizal fungi. Beyond that, we can't go any deeper. So all of this is put together. You can look at a fungal to bacterial ratio. You can track how that community changes in response to management. It is influenced by climate. It is influenced by rainfall, biological system. But the number one influencer of the microbial community in your soil is the plant community. And my PhD advisor is a PLFA guru. 30 years continuous wheat, Western Nebraska, monitoring the microbial community every year. And they do all this really hardcore statistics, like cluster analysis and all these different things that I don't understand. And they can categorize this community. The very first year they planted corn, the entire community shifted. and went straight to what they call a classic corn community. So that's how fast these organisms can respond to management. So back to the question on compost. Static compost in a pile, if you're turning it, it's dominated by bacteria.
So I guess Steve's question is like it's a pile that has I think it's a pile that has a pipe through it. To be honest with you, Steve, for you watching here, I've seen that stuff. I haven't done enough research in it to know about it, but I think they put a long pipe through there and put the compost on top of it. So I'm guessing it would be similar to the properties of a Johnson Sioux, but I don't know enough to answer that question. I guess I'll throw a side question onto that. What ends up being the differences in a thermal aerobic where that's what Elaine Ingham created, right? Where you put the 3 layers, you turn it multiple times, like it hits 160, you turn it multiple times until it's no longer hitting 160. It's ready, like I think within 6 weeks or something like that. Whereas Johnson Sioux takes a year. What are you seeing the differences in those compost, and what will each one of those bring to a system?
Yeah, so the big difference with most of this is the heat and disturbance. Okay, so much like in your soil, fungi don't like disturbance. They don't like tillage, right? So turning piles and that kind of thing are going to disrupt fungal networks and things like that. That doesn't mean that they're void of fungi. It just means that they disrupt the networks and they kind of have to start over. But in that process, they're going to make spores and a lot of times, and you're going to have spores in this system. The reason why compost overall can help certain compost can help promote fungi is because fungi really thrive on high carbon material. And with Johnson Sioux, the idea and I'm coming from a very limited understanding because I don't make Johnson Sioux, but is that longer time and the fact that it's as far as I understand, you're not turning it over and doing all this stuff, right? It's kind of static, and it'll go anaerobic for a while at really high levels of metabolism because bacteria are going to consume oxygen rapidly and they're going to release and eat all this stuff. But over time, the system becomes aerobic again and it's not being disturbed, which is why some of the fungal numbers in those types of composts are so much higher than what we would see from more traditional, large pile turning and wetting and type of situation. So what that can bring to the soil then, of course, is that most of our agronomic soils are bacterial dominated. And so bringing in fungi in any way, shape, or form, other than maybe Goss's wilt, right? Some of those, but getting those things out there are beneficial because fungi are what going to really help you build the soil system, stabilize the soil, which again is going to help with water infiltration. We all know how important water is. So that's what's really beneficial with those things. But I will say this, if we don't couple those things with a better managed system overall, the benefits are relatively short term. And you'll have to repeat in order to see that happen, right? We have to support them. Once we get them out there, we got to support them. And if we know that fungi love carbon and complex residue, then we better have residue out there. The fallow periods, I used to say tillage was the most detrimental thing you could do to a soil. I wholeheartedly believe that I was wrong, and it's fallow. Those fallow periods of just even over the winter, I mean, just the fallow periods from harvest to plant in a conventional annual row crop system are hugely detrimental to the biology. And for anybody out there that's got livestock, since we're talking to young red Angus here, how well would your livestock do if you fed them starting in May through September and then walked away, right? And said, well, we'll come see you again next year. They're not going to be happy. They're not going to perform well. A lot of them are going to die. And then next year you have to rebuild that entire herd or that entire health of that system. Well, it doesn't work that way,
Yeah, and I think that, so that's the challenge I'm facing right now, right? So Dad wants to keep wheat in the system. For wheat to be successful in our area, it has to have a long fallow period. I've been, I figure it's probably going to take 3 years of him hearing it from me. But until we heal our soils, I think we have to take wheat out of our system, because you have to have a long fallow period for wheat to be successful. And so in my mind, the most successful system is planting corn, interseeding cover crops, and having at least two species that will overwinter, so that you have the two species in the soil, keeping the biology alive and not taking too much of the moisture out. And then the following year terminating what lived, in April, and then planting again in May, so that you're having the least amount of time with, something that is not, that you have the biology alive for a long period of time.
Yeah. Well, and I guess my challenge to you, Jay, would be to say, well, do you really have to have that long fallow period to make wheat successful? Maybe right now.
For me right now, yeah, because I just haven't built up the soil health. To me, like I'm finding a hard, like I've been, like I tried 1 year of let's keep a living root in the ground as long as possible, and the ground ended up blowing because I planted something to keep a living root out there. It didn't rain, and then the ground blew just from me disking it. So I think that, it's a challenge of, I think the first thing that I'm trying to do is build up the carbon, so that I actually have something that will feed the biology once I get it out there. And then once I get those systems going, that's my theory now. I don't really know how to fix it in our dry, arid environments. I know it's possible because nature tells me it's possible. It's just a matter of me figuring out how to fix it in our environment. And it's been a huge challenge.
No, I understand, and I know every year has challenges, and I know I've talked to several growers this year that say, we haven't raised a crop in 2 years. And I know some really, really wonderful people that have put a ton of effort into this space, and they're really down on themselves because things don't look good, right? And no matter how much we do or don't do, I always say this, rain at the right time and in the right amount can make a really bad farmer look really good. But at the same time, 12 months of no rain can make a wonderful farmer look really bad, because that challenge that's there. And I've been asked this question before, well, what's the one thing that you would love to be able to accomplish in agriculture to really help agriculture? I said, to understand when and how much it's going to rain before it does. I mean, because if we could ever, I know that's a ridiculous, but I mean, if we could ever answer that question, wow, we could eliminate all kinds of issues and problems, right?
Yep.
And management decisions could be made so much easier. So I agree with you. I understand. I've heard those stories. I planted cover crops, took all the moisture out of the ground to grow wheat. Couldn't grow wheat in the fall. Again, that's the risk you walk when you're looking at those arid environments. And I also do know it's, and I've said this too, this is not just I'm going to make this change and it's going to be forward. I mean, positive, right? Well, if you're in a drought-stricken area anyway, or an arid environment, and you grow cover crops, you're going to use moisture.
Yep.
What we hope we get to is a net positive gain, right? But early on, it's a loss. I mean, moisture-wise, it's a loss. And if we do have a drier year than normal that year, it's bad, because you're already on this really fine line anyway, where 2 extra inches can, bin buster year, or 2 less inches is, preventative plan.
Yeah. Well, I think that the one positive thing that I've found, that never fails almost. Well, in the 7 years that I've been doing it, I've never seen a summer cover crop, mix planted after corn or milo. I've never seen that not get 6 feet tall. Like in the worst droughts, it will get 6 feet tall, like because of the micronutrient sharing between the plants, and so to me, like taking it to where it's 1 year corn with cover crops interseeded in between it, and the next year it's just cover crops, and just that, like, that works really well for where I have cattle. But in areas where I can't, that are 12 miles away and I farm it, it's not really realistic to take cattle up there and haul water to it. Those are the systems where I believe that we need to be getting into doing the interseeding the cover crops in between the rows, and working on that kind of system. Um, so I'll go ahead, Lance.
I was just gonna touch base again on the Haney test, because there's a lot of, obviously, since this thing was introduced back in 2010 by Dr. Haney, and I adopted it in 2011 or 12 on the commercial side of things. I mean, look, I've heard every bit of piece of kickback you could possibly have on this thing, right? I mean, everybody's poking holes in it all over the place, and there's nothing wrong with that, because I poke holes in it. So, but I want to talk really quick about what this test really, where it really shines and where it doesn't, really quick, because I think there's this common misconception that it's like, I have to, if I'm regenerative, I should only use this test, and this is the only thing, and every problem I have, I'm going to address with this test. Wrong. That's not how it works. And at the same time, well, if I'm farming mostly conventionally, this test is useless to me. Wrong. That's not true either. So where the Haney test really boils down to and shines is that I tell farmers all the time, what is fertilizer? Fertilizer is gap insurance. Okay. You're taking what you have in the bank, what's in the soil. You're telling this is your goal. You're going to grow corn and you want this yield. Here's what you got. Here's what you need. Here's your gap. Fertilizer fills the gap. It's gap insurance. Couple of issues. Number one, corn removes 0.68 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. But a lot of the industry is telling you to apply 1.1, 1.2, depends on who you ask and what state you're in. They all have a different number. But 1 pound is the lowest I've ever seen. So my question is that if you're applying 1 pound and removing 0.68 or call it 0.7 in your grain, where's this other 0.3 going? Why is it being, why are you being told to put it on? Well, if you're in a wet environment, they tell you to put it on because you're going to volatilize some nitrogen, right? And it's going to leach possibly or go straight back to the atmosphere. If you're in an arid environment, you got the volatilization issue, cold months, whatever. And to be honest with you, what that is just, it's gap insurance on top of gap insurance. Think about that. If in the 1950s and 60s, it was relatively cheap and it was new, right? Shiny and new. It's pretty easy to sell an iPhone 64 or whatever number they're on because everybody wants shiny and new. But if you're a university, if you're a researcher, if you're an agronomist and you're out there spreading your name and your word and trying to make farmers successful, you don't want anybody to fail because it looks really poor on your reputation. So what do? Add a little extra safety net, right? Let's bump this gap insurance up a little bit. Let's make sure that you're completely covered. Okay, so we're already over applying just based on what the crop needs. On the soil test side of things, the issue is that how do we evaluate what you have? Well, we evaluate nitrate. And if you're east of the Mississippi River, they don't even look at nitrate. They just flat say your soil has 0 nitrogen available in it because it's too wet here. So if you're going to grow corn at 200 bushel goal and you're using 1.1 pounds, you're going to apply all 220 units of nitrogen on that crop. You assume you have nothing. West of the Mississippi, we look at nitrate. Nitrogen exists in the soil in hundreds of different compounds. We're looking at 1. And you're evaluating your gap. Okay, now let's use a real world example here. You walk into a bank, you want to buy a new tractor. Tractor's $200,000. I don't know what they cost. Maybe they're $1 million anymore. I don't know. $200,000 tractor. And the banker says to you, well, Jay, how much money do you need to finance? Let's evaluate your gap. Reach into your front left pocket, pull out all the money you got in your front left pocket, and we'll finance your gap. You pull out $5. And he says, well, you need the rest of it. Now, look, if the bank's going to loan you the money for free and they don't care when you're going to pay it back, finance all of it. Who cares, right? What difference does it make? Last time I checked, interest rates are 8%.
Yep.
Fertilizer is not free.
Nope.
And so if I'm going to borrow $200,000 or if I'm going to potentially borrow money to buy this tractor, I really want to know what my gap is. Is it fair for me to just reach in my front left pocket to evaluate my financial gap? I don't think so. Matter of fact, at today's interest rates, I'm digging around in my couch cushions. I'm looking around in my car console. I mean, I want to know what my gap is.
Yeah.
So with this Haney test approach, is saying, well, look, you're going to get credit for nitrate. That's there. You're going to get credit for ammonium. And guys say, well, the ammonium's negligible. Well, okay, on average, ammonium is 5 pounds of credit. But what's 5 pounds across 2,200 acres? At $1 a pound, 10 grand, 12 grand, okay? And then we've got this microbial component. And where Rick really pulled this out was, he's looking at this Illinois state nitrogen rate equation, right? And he's saying, okay, they got all these plots, 0 in, 50, 100, 150, 200, and they're looking at yield, of course, and they're saying, where's your economical rate of nitrogen return? And they say, oh, and here's your curve, and then your yield, and it tops out, and okay, here you go. You should put on 180 units of nitrogen. But what Rick focused on was the zero plots. The zero plots are pushing 60, 70 bushel corn every year. So he says, well, where's the nitrogen coming from? Because when they measure nitrate, guess what? You don't see it. The nitrate's not there. Real world example, Gabe Brown, 10 years ago, ran his soil test. His nitrogen credit from nitrate was 4 pounds to the acre. With his yield goal, the recommendation was 145 units of nitrogen. The Haney test gave him the same 4 pounds of nitrogen for nitrate, gave him 3 or 4 pounds for ammonium, but his biological release was off the charts and it equated out to 160 pounds. So I had to tell this man, who I'd never met and was already as scared of, not to put any nitrogen on. And he says, well, yeah, no, I'm not going to put any on anyway. And he grew 138 bushel corn that year. His yield goal was 145. And now some of you could say, well, yeah, but he didn't reach his goal. Yeah, and his cost of production was under $1.35 a bushel. Who cares? Yep. So that's where the Haney test shines. It's saying, let's really try to evaluate what your true gap is. It's not designed to give you a zero recommendation. Remember, when I said that, I was talking about Gabe. The average reduction is 25 pounds to the acre now on a 6-inch sample. So if you're applying 220, you're getting down to 200. It's not going from 220 to nothing. It's to take steps in that direction. Now, Jay, as you keep building this biology and you keep doing these things, guess what? Your gap gets smaller and smaller and smaller because you're getting more and more and more out of the biological side, because your system is not driven chemically, it's driven biologically. That's the difference between regenerative ag and conventional ag and even organic. So that's the big difference. And that's where that Haney test really shines. If you think you have a copper deficiency or manganese deficiency, that's not where the Haney test shines. We offer those values on the test. We give them to you. They're not useless, but that's not really the big over-encompassing picture of why that test works. And I just wanted to say that here, because I think again, a lot of producers struggling with financing the gap, right?
So would it be better then to do the complete nutrition digestion test with that, so that that you'll know what is available and then you'll know what the activity is with the Haney test?
Absolutely. I mean, because, and you don't need to run the total nutrient digest every single year, because, you know, your net worth doesn't change year to year very much unless you win the lottery or get a divorce, as I always joke. So you don't have to worry about that too much, right? So the Haney test is evaluating the balance of your checking account. The total nutrient digest is doing all of it. It includes the checking account and everything else. So if you've got a high respiration, if you're growing cover crops, we run a cover crop test to tell you exactly how many pounds or tons of biomass you have, how many pounds of nutrients are in that above ground biomass. You get a seed-in ratio. You couple that with the respiration on the Haney test to see how many microbes you have. And then you can take a guess. Yes, it's a guess, but you can take a very educated guess based on all of these factors. How much N and P and K and sulfur can you take back out of that cover crop the first year? It's yours, but that cover crop is mining some of that out of the total nutrient side. It's capturing nitrogen if there's legumes in the mix. You know, take credits for that. Understand the gap, because somewhere along the lines, soil tests were originally designed to give farmers and ranchers power to understand what they needed to buy. But somewhere along the lines, they turned into weapons, in my opinion, against farmers and ranchers, used by the product sales companies to scare you and say, this is all you have. This is it. You have 5 pounds of nitrate out here. You got to buy all of this from me, right? And it puts you in a corner where you feel like if you don't spend that money every single year, you won't grow a crop that year. And what we're trying to do is get to a system to say, you know what? This is your gap. This is what you need. Great. And if you want to push the envelope like Jay, you're doing, and say, I'm not going to put any phosphorus on this year, and I'm okay with it. I'm going to take what I get from my microbes. I'm going to be happy with it. I'm going to save the money up front. I have no idea if it's going to rain, so I'm going to play it a little safer. Great. But then corn goes to $8-9 a bushel, and you had a good year the year before. You got a little extra money, and you go, this is the year I'm going to put a little bit of P on or a little bit of K on to replace some of that I know I'm removing in my crop. But it gives you the financial freedom and the power to make those decisions versus the scare tactic of, well, geez, Jay, if you don't buy 4,000 pounds of maize this year, you're not, you're not going to raise a crop. And that's really the idea. And a lot of the people, I'll mention this, our goal as a program is not to capture people and say, well, trade your input costs on fertilizer and run it all with soil testing. That's not our model. Most of the really big names that you go around and look at and you see all the time, they don't run a lot of soil tests. Why? They're confident in their system. They know what their system's going to do. They don't need to run a soil test, because they're using their eyes and their ears and they're observing what is happening on their farm, and they don't need that reassurance all the time with soil data. Every few years they run a soil test just because they like to put it in a PowerPoint and talk about it or whatever. We're here to help people transition, and then kind of like if we say you go to the doctor because you're sick and the doctor says, well, you need to come in every 3 months and we're going to monitor this. That doesn't mean you're soil testing every 3 months. It's an analogy. You come in all the time and they monitor you, right? And then, hey, you're on the right track. Things are getting better. Your cholesterol is coming down. Your blood pressure is getting better. Keep it up. Keep doing what you're doing. And then eventually they say, you know what? Come in once a year, once every 2 years. Let's do a physical, right? And that's the idea here, because you'll know if you feel good. You can step on a scale and observe the number and, you know, those things. So that's really what we're trying to do.
Awesome. Well, Lance, that kind of concludes the time that we have for this episode. I really appreciate you joining us today. Did you want to add anything else before we close out?
Other than, you know, I get a lot of people that tell me, you know, hey, we're really excited about what you're doing. And I say, well, I appreciate that. And I truly do, but we're only doing this because of what you do, what farmers are doing. You know, it's easy for me to sit here on this side of the screen and talk about it. Talk about the farming part. Had this discussion yesterday, and I said, look, it's we can talk and talk and talk, but it's you guys. It's you guys figuring it out and taking that risk. These are your operations. I say risk, but making that big change, right? Guys like your dad, Jay, you know, and stepping out. So I applaud that. I applaud that, and just want to say thank you to everybody who's willing to buck the status quo, and we'll do it together.
Awesome. Well, guys, that concludes our show for today. Next week, on Wednesday in the morning, I'll have Dr. James White, and we'll talk a lot about what his research is with fungal endophytes and bacteria endophytes and how they're actually penetrating the seed, and so that you guys can kind of understand how seed treatments are really affecting the plant itself. So thanks again, Lance.